Good evening. Oh. Hello. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Wonderful. I'm going to do some quick housekeeping notes, all right? All books tonight are pre-stamped by the author's personal stamp, and there will not be a signing at the end of the program, but she will be at the usual signing table for photos and any additional questions you have. Tonight's format is 20 minutes of the author's personal story to share, 25 minutes Q&A. Oh, having a brain fart, please excuse me. 25 minutes moderated conversation. Last 15 minutes is Q&A from our audience, both in person and virtual. And then photos at the end after we're done. And with that, I'm going to evaporate and we will begin in just a couple moments. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library's Writers Live program. I am Vivian Fisher, many of you probably know me by now, Deputy Chief of Public Services here at the Central Branch. This evening we are pleased to have our guest author, Bernadette Atuahene, in conversation with Lawrence Brown. Bernadette Atuahene, a Harvard and Yale-trained property law scholar whose work focuses on land and homes stolen from Black people. She currently holds the Duggan Chair at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She is the author of We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program, and she directed and produced an award-winning short documentary film about one South Africa family's struggle to regain their land. Atuahene has won several accolades and has published in academic journals and news outlets such as the New York Times and LA Times. Lawrence Brown is the author of The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America. He is a research scientist at Morgan State University's Center for Urban Health Equity and the director of the Black Butterfly Academy, a racial equity education and consulting firm. Please join me in welcoming Bernadette Atuahene, who will discuss her work, Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America, and moderator Lawrence Brown.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It's good to see so many familiar faces tonight. So before getting to the book, I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to do this work. So my parents immigrated to America from Ghana in West Africa. And when I was a child, I knew I had 4 career options and 4 career options only. I could be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a disgrace to the entire family. Ooh. I was bad at math, so engineering was a no-go. The thought of dissecting cadavers makes me want to barf, so that wasn't an option for me. And since I was determined not to be a disgrace, so law was the only option left. But I didn't want to be any old lawyer. Ever since I enrolled at UCLA for undergrad, I knew that I wanted to be a change maker protecting intergenerational wealth in my community. And when I commit to something, y'all, I am all in. I worked myself to the bone and made it to Yale Law School and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government for my graduate studies. And I eventually became a law professor. And now 100% of my scholarly research, writing, and advocacy deals with land stolen from Black people.
All right, all right.
So I do ethnography. So I live and immerse myself in the place I study. My first ethnographic project was examining land stolen in South Africa during apartheid and colonialism. And my first book, We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program, examined the psychological, political, social, and economic consequences of getting land or money back. The book was a huge success. At the official book launch in Johannesburg, the Deputy Land Claims Commissioner himself attended and publicly announced that the commission planned to implement 90% of the book's recommendations. So that first book project, although wildly successful, was really uncomfortable for me in many ways because it looked at Black people as victims, right? Black people being stolen from. So in my next ethnographic project, I wanted to move from Black victimhood to Black agency. And I decided to focus on squatting because this is where vulnerable populations take land instead of being stolen from. And Detroit has one of the largest squatting populations in recent US history. So I applied for this big NSF, National Science Foundation grant to study it, and that's how I actually even got to Detroit. So a squatter is someone who occupies a piece of property without the permission of the record owner. And there are two types of squatters. There's takeovers and holdovers. So a takeover is someone who rolls up onto a piece of land with no prior legal relationship to it. It's what normal people think of as a squatter. But I'm a property professor, and I teach my students about a second category called a holdover. And that's a person who once had a legal relationship to the property, but they fell out of it. They were either, tenants, they had a lease and they fell out of it. But in my case, they were homeowners and they owned the home, they got property tax foreclosed, and then they stayed waiting for the new owner to arrive. Now, at that point, I had known a lot about mortgage foreclosure as a property professor, but I knew very little about mortgage foreclosure. So I began to do my homework, and I found that since 2009, the local government has confiscated 1 in 3 Detroit homes for failure to pay their property taxes. 1 in 3. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. So given the gravity of the situation, I switched my research focus from squatting to property tax foreclosure, and I've lived on Detroit's East Side full-time since 2017, trying to understand the city's property tax foreclosure crisis from those I live beside. Myrisha Brown is more than one of 150 homeowners who I have interviewed for my study. She's a petite brown-skinned woman with a super cute pixie cut. Hers is one of the many stories I tell in my book, Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. So one cold winter day, Myrisha and I returned to the family home on Bayless Street that she had lost to tax foreclosure. And as we walked toward the house, Myrisha said to me, "Man, I haven't been back here since I lost the house and me and my kids were evicted several years back." And as soon as we stepped into the yard, we both noticed that the house was vacant. For Myrisha, that was a total and complete gut punch because she had worked so hard to ensure that her home, her legacy, did not become a vacant, blighted structure like many of the homes on the block and many of the homes in the city of Detroit. As we slowly walked around the perimeter of the house, Myrisha told me about all the places she had been talking about in the multiple interviews we had completed over the years. She said to me, "Prof, this is the spot where the garage used to be. A fire that started next door burned it to the ground." She said, "This right here is a spot where my granddad's beloved apple tree used to be." She said, "After he died, it died and was eventually cut down." And as we moved from the backyard to the side of the home, she stopped and peered through the side window to get a better look at the living room where her grandmama, who lived to age 102, spent her final days. When I saw Myrisha's face turn ashen, I immediately ran over to her side to find out what in the world was going on, and we both could not believe our eyes. The pipes in the home had frozen and burst, covering the living room in at least a foot of ice. Myrisha wailed, and all I could do is wrap her in a big hug, y'all, and cry with her. This home on Bailey Street meant so much to Myrisha because her grandparents fought hell and high water to acquire it. Despite racial covenants, redlining, block busting, urban renewal, and other racist policies, in their retirement, Myrisha's grandparents were finally able to purchase this home. It was without a doubt their dream home. And it was actually in an area where racial covenants made off limits to blacks, but when whites moved to the suburbs, blacks began to move in. The home on Bailey Street was the only asset that Myrisha's grandparents had to pass down. But by the time Myrisha's grandma passed away, I told you she lived to 102, no other family member even wanted the home because it was no longer a valuable asset. It had become a money pit. The home had broken windows covered with plastic to keep the elements out. There was no functioning bath or shower, and plaster was falling from the ceiling. The other homes on the block were in equally bad shape, but what I need you to understand is when modern day redlining, historic and modern day redlining, cut off funds for home improvement, this type of blight is the inevitable result. So given the poor shape of the Bailey Street home, the question is, why was Myrisha so eager to inherit her grandparents' home and so committed to rehabilitating it when other family members wanted nothing to do with the home? When I interviewed Myrisha for the first time, she shared her life with me and gave me some insight into this quandary. And as the oldest child and a woman, we're going to talk about gender, she carried back-breaking caretaking responsibilities on her very narrow shoulders. Myrisha told me that not only did she care for her two children, she also had to care for their father, who was in a wheelchair as a result of a carjacking. She told me that she had to care for her sister, who had a debilitating autoimmune disease, along with her sister's child. Myrisha also had to care for another sister who had irreversible brain damage and that sister's young son. Because of our nation's poorest social safety net, women like Myrisha are forced to fill the gaps at great cost to themselves. After spending time with Myrisha, it became clear to me why she couldn't easily abandon her grandparents' home on Bailey Street. Under no circumstances does Myrisha dodge or evade her family responsibilities. No matter how daunting, she takes them on head on. Rehabilitating her legacy was not something Myrisha wanted to do, it's something she had to do. Some of Myrisha's most precious childhood memories happened on Bailey Street. She said, "You know what, Professor? I remember scooping up the apples my granddaddy shook down from the tree. She told me those were some of the juiciest green apples in the entire city of Detroit." Above all, Myrisha is a proud Detroiter who rides for her city. And she did not want her home to end up as a vacant eyesore, again, like many of the other homes in the city, contributing to the story of Detroit's demise instead of its revival. That's why that day that we both returned to the home on Bailey Street and saw the living room filled with ice, Myrisha felt like a total and complete failure. But what I need you all to know is that Myrisha failed because individual efforts are no match for broken systems. Let me say that again. Myrisha failed because individual efforts are no match for broken systems. The saga started when Myrisha found a yellow door attached to her porch, just like this yellow door on the yellow bag on the front cover of the book. When she opened the bag, she found a legal notice informing her that the property tax foreclosure process had begun, and if she did not pay her debt by March 31st of the following year, Wayne County would actually sell her home at its tax foreclosure auction. When she read that notice, she was flooded with emotion. She felt scared. She felt anxious. She felt depressed. And most of all, y'all, she felt shame. She was ashamed because the yellow bag announced to the entire neighborhood that she was behind on her property taxes and about to lose her grandparents' home. But when she looked up, surprisingly, almost every home on the block had a yellow bag attached to the porch. So at that moment, she knew something was up, but she didn't know exactly what was going on. And when I first met Myrisha and interviewed her, she actually blamed herself for losing her legacy. She said to me, well, Professor, I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. And actually, most city officials I interviewed explained the property tax foreclosure crisis with similar stories of what I call personal irresponsibility. For instance, one official said, well, Professor, the problem here, why we have so many foreclosures is Detroiters, they just don't want to pay their property taxes. Another told me, well, Professor, the problem is that people bought houses they couldn't afford. And one Detroit official, I'm gonna name his name, Mike Szymanski, okay? Detroit's former treasurer. He said to me, Professor, the problem is instead of paying their taxes, they decided to buy purses. But my research tells a different story. It's not a story about personal irresponsibility. It's a story about structural injustice. In researching this book, I have interviewed hundreds of homeowners, government officials, investors. I've combed through reams and reams of property tax assessment data. Y'all, I even took a 9-month course and passed a state exam to become a certified Michigan property tax assessor. I told you, when I'm all in, I'm all in. And my comprehensive research shows that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 53 and 84% of properties the city of Detroit assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution, which says no property can be assessed at more than 50% of the property's market value. And the lowest valued homes, like the home on Baylor Street, were the hardest hit. In addition to my investigation, the Detroit News did an expose and found that the city of Detroit overtaxed Detroiters by at least $600 million. Since over 30% of Detroiters live below the poverty line, many homeowners didn't have the money to pay these illegally inflated property taxes. And what's worse, it was property taxes they weren't even supposed to be paying in the first place. In Michigan, when a homeowner lives below the poverty line, they qualify for something called the property tax exemption. But the city of Detroit erected so many barriers that people never knew about it and never applied for this entitlement. So yes, tens of thousands of Detroit homeowners face property tax foreclosure because they failed to pay illegally inflated property taxes they weren't supposed to pay in the first place. It's then no wonder that Myrisha saw yellow bags affixed to almost every porch on her block. My God, my God. And what I need you to know is when the local government takes a family's home for failure to pay property taxes, it doesn't just take bricks and mortar. It takes intergenerational wealth. It takes priceless memories. Through the chaos of eviction, people lose family photos. They lose grandmama's quilts. They can't recover the height marks that we etch into the door frame to mark the growth of our children. They're separated from longtime neighbors who had become family. Through property tax foreclosure, people lose so much. Because most tax foreclosed homes were inherited and fully paid off, homeowners blame themselves for losing mama's house, for losing granddaddy's house. Because if there was a mortgage on the home, the bank would have taken it before the state took it. During the interviews I conducted of tax foreclosed homeowners, there was so much shame and self-lambasting that when the interview was over, I had to call many people back. I didn't want to mess up my data, but when it was over, I called them back and I said, you know what, sis? I said, you know what, my brother? There is no reason to feel shame. Systemic injustice was hidden in those complex property tax calculations. And these racist policies put you in a position of trying to slay a dragon with a butter knife. So according to my brother Ibram Kendi, racist policies are written and unwritten laws and processes that produce and sustain racial inequity. The way property taxes are administered in Wayne County undoubtedly qualifies. So Wayne County has 43 cities, 33 of which have a supermajority of white people, 70% or more, and 3 have a supermajority of black people, Detroit, Inkster, and Highland Park. One of my studies shows that the majority black cities are overtaxed and foreclosed on at a much greater rate than the majority white cities. This is racial injustice. But I need you to know this injustice is not at all exclusively a Detroit problem. Detroit is ground zero for a national problem. A national study shows that blacks and Hispanics pay on average a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites for the same bundle of goods, which equals $300 to $400 more per year. Racialized property tax administration is a racial justice issue that our country has not yet even begun to address. And most importantly, this is a quintessential example of what I call in my book, predatory governance, which is when local governments intentionally or unintentionally raise public dollars through racist policies. We've seen predatory governance before in Ferguson, Missouri. Beyond what happened to our dear brother Michael Brown, there is an excellent DOJ report. And if you guys have not read it, you need to go and read this DOJ report, documenting how the police in Ferguson engaged in unconstitutional policing by unfairly subjecting African Americans to excessive fines and fees. Who benefited financially? Not any corrupt police officer, but the city of Ferguson itself. Predatory governance is what's happening in Detroit and many other cities where the local governments are inflating property taxes of black and brown homeowners. Who financially benefits? Not any corrupt public official, but the public coffers themselves. But the good news is, just as Detroit is ground zero for this national problem, Detroit is also the epicenter of the resistance. Once my research exposed these hidden structural problems, this information lifted the shame, allowed homeowners to stop beating themselves up, and made room for righteous indignation so that the fight back could begin. In 2017, my students and I joined with over a dozen grassroots community organizations to create something called the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, and we have 3 goals and 3 goals only. The first goal is to stop these illegally inflated property tax assessments in Detroit and throughout the nation. Our second goal is to stop these ongoing foreclosures until we can verify that people are losing their homes for taxes they actually owe and not these illegally inflated property taxes. And the third and final goal is to provide compensation, because we can't just be having this verified evidence of illegally inflated property taxes talking about some oops, I'm sorry. We need some compensation. So by building community power, we have had several significant wins. We have halted 13,000 tax foreclosures by pressuring the Wayne County Treasurer to place a moratorium on owner-occupied homes in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and we are busy right now as we speak working on the moratorium for 2025. We have helped over 1,000 Detroit homeowners successfully apply for a total of $4.4 million in federal ARPA funding to pay their illegally inflated property tax debt. We have appealed the inflated property tax assessments for over 1,000 Detroit homeowners completely free of charge. And we have secured $6 million from the city of Detroit for compensation. But most importantly, through the Dignity Restoration Project, we're raising $10 million to compensate the hardest hit Detroiters like Myrisha, who lost their homes due to illegally inflated property taxes that they were not even supposed to be paying in the first place because they qualified for this property tax exemption that I told you all about. So if you guys are interested, we had some flyers when you came in. It's called the dignityrestorationproject.org. You can go there to donate. Again, dignityrestorationproject.org is where you can go to donate. Your contribution sends a message saying, I see you and I affirm your dignity, to Myrisha and the 30,000 other people who the local government unfairly took their homes for property taxes they weren't supposed to be paying in the first place. To conclude, I'm glad I didn't become an engineer. I'm glad that I did not become a doctor. I'm glad that I became a lawyer fighting against the theft of Black homes, fighting to secure our intergenerational wealth and dignity. Both of my parents have gone on to glory, but I know they're smiling down on me because, I've managed not to be a disgrace. Ooh. But more importantly, and actually more seriously, people in Detroit and throughout the country who are filled with shame because they're fighting a losing battle against racist policies, they are not a disgrace either. Let me stop there. Thank you.
My. Professor, Reverend Dr. Bernadette Atuahene. My. You done laid it out. I don't even need to say too much. But welcome to your sister Chocolate City.
Yes.
Here in Baltimore, Maryland. And how much will it take us to get you here to come to Baltimore?
I'll come anytime y'all need me.
Oh, look at that. Look at that. All right, we're going to take a plate. We're going to need to take a plate and bring her back because we're facing some of the same issues here. Matter of fact, we had Professor Andrew Carl here last year to talk about the black tax, which I think is what you're describing. This is the black tax. That Black residents in our hyper-segregated cities, both Baltimore and Detroit, are Category 5 hyper-segregated cities, the most intense form of racial segregation, according to Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton and their colleagues. And I love you mentioned the term predatory governance. There's another term you have in your book I'd like for you to elaborate on, and that's bureaucratic violence. Can you speak a little bit on bureaucratic violence?
Absolutely. So, when Michael Brown, with all the Sandra Bland, all of these killings, we're focused on these moments of physical violence, as we should be. And these moments of physical violence, we're focused on it. Those of us who've been subjected to the violence knew it existed all along. But now that we all have sentinels in our pockets, right, cell phones ready to record, we now can record this physical violence that has been happening all along. And other people are like, oh, I didn't know this was happening, right? But the point is the focus is on the physical violence. But what I'm saying and what I'm talking about in this book is the bureaucratic violence that's occurring simultaneously that nobody's talking about, that doesn't make front page of the news, that doesn't incite marches, right? But it's doing just as much damage, if not more, than the physical violence, which we are focused on, rightly so. But this is about also extending our conversation from this moments of physical violence to talking about these forms of bureaucratic violence as well.
And I like the way you do that, especially in the book, because of course, you talk about these predatory tax assessments and arrangements that take place, but you also walk the reader through this intergenerational journey that Black people and even you discuss the Bucci family from Italy, how they migrated to Detroit and the black family with Grandpa Brown, who migrates to Detroit from North Carolina. And so you tell these intergenerational stories, and I love that you're just such a great storyteller. Because, I mean, the book...
That's my daddy.
Hey, your book manages to be both this meta framing of historical trends and these micro stories of individuals and families. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Browns and the Bucci's.
Absolutely. So the whole book is based on two families. And what's so interesting about these two families is they're both poor sharecroppers in their place of origin. Grandpa Bucci was a sharecropper in Italy. In a sharecropping system there was called mezzadria. And as you said, Grandpa Brown was a sharecropper in North Carolina. They both come to Detroit around the same time, between 1902 and 1903 and 1905, and they both start to work at the same factory, Ford's River Rouge factory, which was one of the meanest, dirtiest, dangerous of the factories, Ford's factories in Detroit. So they both start working at this factory at the same time. And, you know, in my academic work, because I'm a law professor, I tell you all the stats, but in this book, I show you the effect of racist policies. Because Grandpa Bucci, he didn't have it easy. At that point, that's before before Italians became white. So he experienced lots of discrimination, right? And he even lost a finger because he worked, before he made his way to Detroit, he worked in the coal mines of France and lost an actual finger. Man had 4 fingers, right? So in no way did Grandpa Bucci have an easy life. But at no point was Grandpa Bucci ever prevented from entering the suburbs through a racially restrictive covenant, right? That prevented him from entering certain neighborhoods, especially the suburbs, where the homes were cheaper, bigger, with better amenities. Grandpa Bucci never had an easy life, but at no point was his community redlined. The federal government drawing a red line around his community, indicating to the banks that they should not invest in this particular community. And the inevitable result of that redlining was blight, right? And disorder and deterioration. And the red line was drawn just because people were black. At no point, although Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, at no point was his community redlined. Although Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, at no point was his community subjected to block busting. Right? It was the first black family moves on the block. These real estate intermediaries say the blacks are coming, right? Because because of redlining, the presence of blacks would in fact reduce your property values, right? Because of these federal policies. And so then the whites left, and then they resold the homes at inflated prices to blacks. Right? At no point, Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, but at no point was his community subjected to urban renewal, where the entire community was decimated, taking blighted homes and unblighted homes, taking cultural institutions and black businesses. And then black people, because of segregation, only had a few communities that they could move into. And then those communities became communities of strangers. We lost the social capital that kept the community safe, kept the community sane, kept the community together, kept the community strong. That social capital was gone with urban renewal, and now they created communities of strangers, vulnerable. So although Grandpa Bucci had it hard, he was never subjected to these racist policies, racially restrictive covenants, block busting, urban renewal, predatory mortgage lending, racialized property tax administration. So the end of the story is Grandpa Bucci's grandson owns Grandpa Bucci's home in Livonia, in a suburb of Detroit, and that home's worth over $250. I asked Robert, why are you still living in the home? He said, why wouldn't I? The mortgage is paid off, okay? Where Grandpa Brown's granddaughter, Myrisha, I told you, inherited a money pit, not an asset, and it was a money pit not because and all the homes were deteriorated because they never could access the money for home repair loans and mortgages. And so what she inherited was a money pit. But the narrative we want to talk about in America, Grandpa Bucci has what he has because he worked hard. Grandpa Brown worked hard too. Grandpa Brown worked hard too. And so the book is a way to really show America instead of telling them, using the lives of these two families, the impact of racist policies on intergenerational wealth.
Speaking of work, you have this narrative about how they worked in the factory. And I like how you discuss like workplace discrimination. So they're working, and can you talk a little bit about, the men who are in these factories, how dirty they're getting because they're doing this extremely arduous and dangerous work, and then the sort of segregation, racial segregation in the plant, River Rouge, I believe you said, in Detroit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important point because especially, I told you I lived most of the year in Detroit. And, these unions, the unions are part of our movement. And, they want to talk about this, how it's solidarity and unified workers. That's what it is now. But that's not what it always was, right? Unions used to be a vehicle for protecting white privilege. In terms of workers, when the Great Migration and blacks started coming in masses to these northern cities, unions initially protected white privilege, meaning that African Americans got the job at River Rouge. Those are the jobs that they had. And, whites got carpentry jobs and kind of easier jobs. They were promoted first, et cetera. And so that's actually what makes the story between Grandpa Bucci and Grandpa Brown so interesting, is because Grandpa Bucci was actually one of the few whites in River Rouge because it was so dangerous because of they had a melting iron, et cetera, that again there were few whites in River Rouge, and Grandpa Bucci was one of them. And so again, the book is really saying, look at these two men who started off very poor in a very similar situation, but them and their progeny had very different outcomes because of these racist policies. And the last thing I want to say about that is, again, these, and I talked about it in my talk, but these narratives of personal irresponsibility, it's not just in this property tax area. These narratives of personal responsibility are pervasive. And that's how, when people go to a black community, right, and they see, houses are deteriorated, right, there's no investment in the house, who do they blame? They blame the black people in that community. Why? Because these racist policies have no shoulders on which to carry the blame. These racist policies are invisible, but what's visible are the black people in those communities. The redlining, all of this stuff, the racial covenants, that's invisible. And so who gets the blame is the black people in the communities, when in fact it's the racist policies, layers of racist policies, that is really causing the blight that we see, the deterioration that we see. Again, but these invisible policies have no shoulders on which to carry the blame.
Yes. I wonder, when I was reading your book, if you intentionally set about centering this theme of how racism is designed to keep black people in their place. And I see here on page 3, you said white vigilantes murdered them for being uppity and not knowing their place. Then you have another quote on page 19, the action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that nigger will necessitate our killing 1,000 niggers in the South before they will learn to take their place again. And then page 30, if they did not remain in their appointed ghettos, whites in partnership with law enforcement would put them back in their place by any means necessary. Was that intentional, this notion of how racism is designed to keep black people in our place based on a social hierarchy and in our place based on spatial location?
Yeah, so those 3 instances, so the first instance you talked about, it was one of the characters in the book, Miss May, talks about how she came to Detroit, and it's because her family was really successful down south, and because of the success, one of her uncle who owned a lot of land was hung in his front yard, and it was after that hanging that they got up and left and moved to Detroit. So that was, and he was hung because he got out of his place.
He owned land.
He owned,
was it? Yep.
Her family owned land, and so they had to run, leaving everything behind, hung in his front yard, sending a message.
Terrorism.
we need to call it exactly that, terrorism. Second example you're talking about is with Roosevelt. There's a piece of history where Booker T. Washington comes to the White House, and after he comes to the White House, there's all of this uproar in these Southern papers, and I quote from the actual Southern papers about letting Booker T. Washington basically fanning the flames of social equality, and whites, wanted to extinguish it, right? And there were things that the quote you read was from one of the papers in Georgia. I quote a paper in Louisiana and Georgia talking about that incident. And then the third example you gave was talking about how, again, racial covenants was one way. In the South, they were hanging people, okay? And that put fear. But in the North, they the same effect, but politely. They tucked the racism into deeds, right? Through these racially restrictive covenants. That was their way of keeping blacks out. And so the book is talking, that third segment you mentioned, it was talking about the ways in which violence was actually used when blacks tried to move into these neighborhoods. We have a really famous story in Detroit about a doctor who, was in Black Bottom, which is one of the famous communities that was subjected to urban renewal and destroyed, but had lots of black businesses, but was deteriorated because because of redlining. And he moved, his name is Dr. Sweet. He tried to move into a white neighborhood that had a covenant, and he moved there, and a mob met him, the mob supported by the police. His brother fired a shot, and a white man was killed. Thurgood Marshall was on the case. Everyone in the house actually got acquitted. I don't know how that happened. That was a miracle. They got acquitted, but some years later, Dr. Sweet actually committed suicide. And so it just, shows you that there was so many that wasn't an anomaly, this Dr. Sweet story. There was a lot of violence when blacks tried to move into these white communities. And so, yes, so when you're saying, is there a trend there? Absolutely, there's a trend. But I do want to point out the fact of, in my concept of racial governance, predatory governance, I actually take a step back and don't deal with intent. Okay, what people intended to do, or not to say intent is not important, but I want us to take a step back and not talk about intent for a minute, right? Because the point is, if I'm over here and I sock you and you out here bleeding, we're gonna talk about, did she mean to sock you or not? Or let's stitch you up and stop the bleeding, right? And so in the book, I actually talk about, let me make a separate point to say, I intentionally do not use the word structural racism, systemic racism. I use instead the term racist policy. And that's a move I got from my dear brother, Ibram Kendi. And what's the difference? When you talk about structural racism and systemic racism, that is so overwhelming. What in the world can you do about that? Number one, it's too broad, baby, right? But when you talk about racist policies, number one, it's language that everyday people can understand. And number two, it forces a person articulating the claim to enumerate the actual policies, which is what I do in my book, right? This is done because these are the actual policies. And once you enumerate the policies, we can then get to work on disassembling those policies. So when you change the language from talking about structural and systemic racism to racist policies, again, it makes us do the work of enumerating the policies so we can get to work on disassembling them. It moves us from a place of passivity to a place of action. And so that's not a small thing. And then in this term, I create predatory governance. Again, I don't focus on intent because Holly, that's the way Americans think about race. It's black hats, white hats, good guys, bad guys. Everybody's looking for the racist, right? When in fact, there are systems. So that's why the definition of racist policy is it doesn't include any intent. A racist policy is any process, procedure, law, policy that produces racial inequity. Let's focus on the racial inequity produced instead of focusing on intent. Let's focus on the correcting the racial inequity. And so that's why, again, the term racist policies, the term predatory governance focuses on the result, which is a racial inequity, so we can get to cleaning that up.
I think that's, yes. I think that's very helpful, particularly when we're talking about cities that have black political leadership today. I think that, but I think what you're saying is very helpful for that very dynamic. And the last thing I'll ask before we get to questions is, Detroit has a reparations task force right now. Can you speak a little bit about, are they buying your book? Are they getting a hold of this? Because I think you lay out the story of Detroit really, really well.
Yeah. So we're definitely working together. But what we look at is, I always say, if Detroit is, so there's a whole debate in the reparations. Where should we start? A lot of people say we should start with slavery. Ta-Nehisi Coates in his famous article says, let's start with Jim Crow. And my argument, I said, let's start with yesterday, when they stole this land and money in Detroit. Let's start with yesterday. And you all, if we cannot get this right in Detroit, this 80% black city, where even the mayor has agreed, no one is fighting my data. No, everyone has agreed that these taxes were illegally inflated. There's no debate. That's not a contended point. So if we can't get it right, where there's empirically proven injustice, right? Then that happened yesterday, then the whole reparations movement is in peril. So my argument is, we need to start in Detroit, start this reparations movement in Detroit with what happened yesterday, and then move forward in time from there. So that's the strategy I propose for the reparations movement, is we need to start in this 80% black city called Detroit, and then move from there. Okay, again, if we can't get it right in Detroit, then we're all just wasting our time and our energy.
Wow, that's amazing, because I've thought redlining should be the start, but you've just convinced me. Start with yesterday. Start with yesterday. So at this point, y'all give it up one more time. Professor Atuahene. Yes. Powerful. Powerful. So we're going to turn it to the audience, to you, for questions at this time.
Wonderful. We have 15 minutes for your questions, both online and in person. If you have a question, you're going to come to the microphone where I am standing, and the microphone on the other side of the auditorium where my colleague is standing. And I'm going to start us off with a question from our online audience. How long did it take for you to collect and compile all of the research and information for Plundered? How did you balance that with your full-time job?
Well, don't get me started. So this took 10 years. I've been working on this. And what's so interesting is, I'm an academic, but I do things, I'm on the outside of the academy, because the academy is necessarily extractive. So how research is usually conducted is, academics come into underprivileged, poor communities with their own research questions that they've made, and then they give some modest research incentive to the community, and they do a couple things. Number one, they don't even come back to the community members they interviewed and give them the article or book that they wrote. Okay, and they don't come back and to spread the information about in the community. And why don't they do that? It's not because they're bad people. It's because the academy doesn't give you credit for the hard work of dissemination. You get no credit for that. So you have to do it all on your personal time. So it's a structural problem in the academy that it's extractive. So, if I'm in the academy and I decide I'm very, but I'm not going to be extractive. So when I came across, first of all, as you know, I came in trying to study one thing. When the situation turned, my research question changed. And that's what needs to happen. I'll come back to the squatting book, because that's an interesting book too. But when you do ethnography, it's not a game. It's not theoretical. These are my actual neighbors who are losing their homes, my church members. It's not some theoretical enterprise. So I threw myself all in. And when you have these findings, again, my study found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of these 7 years, anywhere between 53 and 84% of homes were taxed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. So, before I went to law school, I was a community organizer. So that's exactly what we did. We got to work, building power and organizing. And, And that's what we did. And so, but you know, it's so crazy where we all these wins I just told you about that we've made. I do all of that on my spare time. I don't get less teaching. I don't get less committee work. It's just a whole extra job that I'm doing on the side. And it's because the academy is fundamentally broken. But I'm willing to do it because, you know, I'm a spiritual woman. This is what God has me doing this season. So I'm not working for them. And I'm happy to do it. And I'm glad God chose me for this work at this moment. But yeah, the academy is broken. And so it took me a long time. And how do I find the time? I just had to, you know, that's just what it is.
Good evening. My name is Nika Namdi. I'm actually the executive director of the SOS Fund here in Baltimore. We do similar work. We have the exact same problem. We have a gross income calculation that is under assessing properties with the highest market value and over assessing properties with the lowest market value. We have a tax lien system that sells a debt where people could lose their entire home equity and neighborhood for a $1,000 debt. And so we've been organizing with some of the legal service partners and community groups for some years. And I'm just wondering, with what you have done in Detroit, there's also an active lawsuit. Like Baltimore City is currently being sued but because of the Tyler versus Hennepin suit. And we're leveraging that to try to make sure that we can stop the existing tax sale system. So I'm wondering, did you all leverage a lawsuit at all in Detroit, or were you able to organize and pressure the elected officials politically to get the wins that you have?
Excellent question. Sis, and let's connect afterwards. Because we created something called the Property Tax Appeal Project. And we started in Detroit, but we also have, so what we're doing is, because we have a branch in Detroit, Milwaukee, and then also Chicago. And in each of those three places, we're doing it a little differently. In Detroit, it's community advocates that do the legal work. In Chicago, it's an international law firm. And in Milwaukee, it's a law clinic. And our goal is to figure out how to do these property tax appeal projects. And then once we figured it out, do a how-to kit and say, look, if you all in whatever city, majority black and brown, because we know that's who's being victimized, want to start your own property tax appeal project, here's a kit on how to do it. We've already done it in these 3 cities. So that's what we're working on. We're actively working on creating those how-to kits, et cetera, so that we can put it online and create a community where we can then say, hey sis, if you want to get this going in Baltimore, we got the steps for you. So we're working on that. So we'll talk about that. But let's talk about this lawsuit. So I'm a law professor. Thank you for asking that question. I should have asked you to ask the question. But let me tell you about the law. So that's what, I'm a law professor, and we mislead our students, okay? We tell them if there's something illegal, you go to court and you fix it up. We don't tell them about all the instances where procedural barriers prevent us from getting substantive injustice. And this is a quintessential example of that. All right, so we take this to court, right? We're lawyers. And not only do we take it to court, but honey, we have the dream team, okay? We got NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU of Michigan, and for the deep pockets, Covington and Burlington out in DC. All right, you can't have better public interest legal representation than what we had. We go to the court, and first of all, we can't go, and anyone who does litigation, no, you don't want to be in state court for any civil rights type issue. You want to be in federal court, but we're blocked out of federal court because of something called the Tax Injunction Act, which you can't take to federal court any issue involving state taxation. So we're blocked from federal court, so we have to sue in state court. So we go to state court, Judge Colombo says, you came to the wrong court. You don't need to be here in state court, you need to be in the Michigan Tax Tribunal. So we appeal. I'm talking about, this is when we started to organize. We had the community all in red shirts. At the appeal hearing, they acknowledged us, but they said they still ruled against us. Went to the Michigan Supreme Court, and there, as Michigan Supreme Court, they grant cert. They didn't grant cert, so the lower court decision stood. It's called improper venue. So that means we had to sue in the Michigan Tax Tribunal. And there are three reasons why that killed the case, this procedural decision. Number one, the Michigan Tax Tribunal is not a court, it's an administrative agency. The judges aren't even lawyers, a lot of them are real estate appraisals. So that means they don't have injunctive power. And in the law, that's when the court tells you to do something or not to do something. And that's what we're asking for, is an injunction against Detroit to stop with these illegally inflated property taxes, but they don't have injunctive power. Also, because it's not a court, right? They actually don't have the power to do class actions because it's not a court, which means you have to litigate one by one by one. And we were bringing the lawsuit for structural injustice, okay? And the third and final reason that this procedural issue killed the case is because of if you go to the Michigan Tax Tribunal, you had to bring a case between February 1st and February 15th, where the Fair Housing Act, which is what we were suing under, gives you 2 years. So for those three reasons, the decision saying we had to sue in this administrative agency completely kills the case. And so it's so hard for people to believe that we have all of this empirically proved, all of this data showing these systemic unconstitutional property tax assessments, but there has been no way to sue in court, okay? So what we've done, because law wasn't a venue, like the sister said, we then went to politics. And that's why we formed the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, which in addition to all of the wins I described in my talk, we've passed 2 pieces of legislation. We passed a property tax reform legislation, which cleaned up all the barriers to the property tax reform. We last November passed a property tax reform ordinance, which cleans up a lot of the problems, what I learned when I became an assessor, and about, to clean up the Detroit. So we are now moving full scale into the political solutions because the law let us down. And what I need you to know is this is not an anomaly. There are lots of instances where, again, substantive justice is undermined by procedural barriers.
Good evening, Queen Bernadette, and welcome to Baltimore. The Holy Spirit must have sent you as an angel, because I started out my morning at another branch, and I usually scrutinize the Compass. That's a magazine that the library presents to the customers. And I've been coming here since I was a kid. I raised my 2 daughters here as a kid, as kids, and now they're both college graduates. Someone told me about that I took a class, one of the classes they offer, a computer class this morning, and then the instructor, he told me that, because he knew I shared a little bit with him about my difficulty with my properties, and he said, oh, well, the lawyers are in the library today down at Central, and this is the library I usually frequent more so than anything. I've never, in the years that they've been offering, never been able to catch the lawyers. My goal right now is replevin. This is a picture of my property. I've been carrying around this picture. You see it's getting raggedy, but I have criminals that's been going in and out of my backpack. I've been violated. I've been raped. Just in September of last year, someone illegally put a fake, invalid eviction notice on my door using the sheriff's department. I'm from Baltimore all my life. And I know from seeing other people evicted or whatever, that you have to, it's a court process. And they put this fake flyer on my door telling me different dates so that I need to be, right now, and I'm talking September, but right now I know that my worldly possessions are still in the property, but they changed the locks, they put a grate on my living room window, and so on and so forth. What happened was they made it unsafe for me to stay there. And I'm a senior. I've been to my state's attorney. I've been to my senator's office, my congressman's office. I've been to Maryland Lawyers Volunteer Services. I've recently been to legal aid last Friday, and I found out today that legal aid are the people who are the lawyers in the library. I brought into the paralegal who had greeted me that I'm looking to get assistance in applying for replevin. You're a law professor, I'm sure you know what a replevin is. The paralegal did not know what a replevin was. I sat with the person after doing the intake, and they brought a lawyer out who was not a real estate attorney, but he told me he was some type of lawyer. And he said, I can't do that. I researched utilizing these libraries all around Baltimore City and Baltimore County, and I learned what a replevin is. First, I filed a redemption in 2019 when I found out that's how it initiated. A fake foreclosure was sent to my property. Taxes paid, year 2012, but I received this foreclosure in 2019. For the sake of time, just as you shared with the other lady, I would love to connect with you so that I can share what I've been going through since 2019.
And
where
let's the
a
three of
property-
us, because that sister probably has some resources for you too, but let's, afterwards, 1,000% we're gonna connect.
But because I'm not an attorney, I keep getting obstruction and pushback for the journey that I've taken. I filed a redemption in 2019. And prior to me getting the response, I filed an appeal because some nice lady, probably like yourself, in the land records, she told me, file that appeal. I did, and the judge granted it. But the judge that dealt with the initial request, he denied it. And it just so happened to be a judge that dealt with, I don't know if you heard of the Freddie Gray case, but that's criminal. How did he get connected to residential? And so you mentioned structural injustice. He mentioned bureaucratic violence and racist policy, but nobody mentioned corruption. And so if someone targeted you when there's like 15,000 plus properties sitting on the books of Baltimore City, I'm an accountant. That's my background, but I've been unemployed for quite some time because I get obstruction and finding employment, obstructing and dealing with my properties. I own several properties, and if you ever drive around in Baltimore City, you see all these yellow and red signs, Ashland auction, and there's a lot of corruption, and you have a lot of foreigners, Middle Eastern, that are creating and trying to push. Like I said, I'm a senior, and they violated my home. I've lived in the property before all of this happened. The year in question of me, I found out during COVID, after 129, when I got the letter in August of 2019, that there was a $36 penalty and fee that's flagged my property.
Sis, let me stop you
to
and
the
let's talk
thing.
afterwards, because this is a lot of detail.
It is.
Let's-
That's why I
let's-
said for the sake of
let's
time.
talk to-
But
let
I'm
me-
hoping that you can direct me. Or
I don't know
connect
much about
me.
Baltimore, but I'm gonna help you as much as I
Connect me,
can.
okay.
And I do want to say one thing to what you're saying, sis, is that you're exactly right about all of this. Who is most affected are seniors.
Yeah.
Period.
But yet they have
Because
all
those
these
are the
resources.
people, again, when you deal with property tax issues, a lot of times these are paid off houses. And because if it had a mortgage on it, again, the bank would take it. So who has paid off houses? It's our seniors. So it's not, in all over, that is the population who is being most victimized by all of this property tax injustice. But let's talk afterwards in
Okay.
detail.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
We've got time. Oh, sorry. Whoa, there we go. We have time for 2 more questions before one short announcement and then the end of our program. So take it away.
Good evening. So it's funny, you brought up the point about intent. The Detroit Land Bank, for example, I believe that some folks intended that to be able to be a vehicle to deal with speculators and sort of be more efficient in terms of getting some of these properties actually turned over. But that some feel that the result of that was, the ability to snatch up properties with the land bank. And Baltimore is considering something very similar. So I wanted to know what was your experience with the land bank in Detroit, and if you could redo the land bank from the beginning, because we're very much still working through the process here in Baltimore. I mean, we're looking at $6 billion of investment coming at the city, so gentrification is coming hard. So we need something, but how do we make sure the land bank actually maximizes its potential here, where maybe there was some concern about that in Detroit?
Yes, as you know, the land bank is really controversial in Detroit. So they're doing a lot of things wrong. I'll talk about one of the things that they're doing right in terms of, because you're looking for, in terms of what we should be thinking about here in Baltimore, is that one of the things, again, that investors hate is that in Detroit, if you are a longtime Detroit resident, Detroit public school teacher, right, you get priority for land bank homes. And which means that a lot of the land bank homes have actually gone to Detroiters instead of investors from outside. So looking at Detroit and putting those requirements and giving these preferences to local people is essential. What I would say is what the first thing I would want you to look into and advocate for in Baltimore. But the land bank, again, is what's going on with the land bank in Detroit. It's part of a cycle of dispossession. So, you know, they're illegally inflating the houses, and then they get foreclosed upon, and then, you know, when they're sold at auction, some of them sell at the auction, but the ones that don't sell at the auction go to the land bank. And so the homes in the land bank are tax foreclosed homes. So it's all part of a cycle, right? And so you can't talk about the land bank without talking about tax foreclosure. How did they get their inventory so large? It's because of these illegally inflated property taxes and 1 in 3 people losing their home. Those homes end up in the land bank. Again, the homes with value in the few neighborhoods that are, you know, the story of Detroit's ascension is happening, but only in a few neighborhoods. So when a home in those particular 5 or 6 neighborhoods goes into foreclosure, those sell well at the auction, right? But the rest of the homes, again, end up in the land bank. So, so that would be my advice for you, is to make sure that the land bank has preferences for local people that allow them to acquire the homes before people from outside of the community.
Oh, hey, how you doing? I remember you mentioned originally the man in Chicago. I'm terrible with names, but I was gonna ask for the time, pretty much as a black man, to get out in the suburbs to say like a higher end area. What did he specialize in business-wise, or like how did he operate to get to that point?
Who are you talking about, baby?
It was the man you mentioned who was hung originally in Chicago.
Who was hung?
Yeah.
No, the hanging happened actually in Georgia.
Oh,
And then after the
Chicago.
hanging happened in Georgia, they came in the Great Migration to Detroit.
Okay. Oh, but what did he do to get to that point? Just asking in Atlanta, Georgia.
Landowner.
Yeah, so you're asking me why he got hung?
Oh no, what do you do to get to say the suburbs itself?
Get to what?
Stay in the suburbs.
Yeah. How do you?
Are you talking about Grandpa Bucci?
Yeah. Wait.
Oh,
I'm
Dr.
sorry.
Sweet.
Dr. Okay, Dr. Sweet. I got it.
Okay, yeah, okay, yes, Dr. Sweet was from Chicago. I mean, Detroit, excuse me. And so you're asking him, how did he get the house in the first, Dr. Sweet got the house?
Yeah.
Yes, so it wasn't actually, Dr. Sweet's house it was in an all-white area, but it was actually in the city limits of Detroit, actually on Detroit's east side where I live. And so when Dr. Sweet, they bought the home, and again, he was a doctor, he was a medical doctor, and he worked at one of the few hospitals at that time that served black people. And so he was a man of means, and he wanted to move out of Black Bottom, right? And so, but again, when he tried to move out of Black Bottom, this is when all the problems started that I described. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Thank you for asking your question, dear.
No problem.
Do we have time for one really quick question?
Yeah, I had a question more related to the period during the mortgage-backed security crisis and the thing called an assignment of mortgage. And I wonder how that may play in foreclosures, not just obviously it affected people all over, but especially in the Black community. So that what would happen is that banks would sell this thing called the assignment of mortgage to other banks, and people wouldn't actually know that, and they would say, okay, my house is foreclosed on, but if you actually requested that piece of paper, you could forestall the foreclosure. I wonder if that.
Yeah, so again, when I talk about foreclosure, the first place people's minds go is to mortgage foreclosure, because that's what we're used to. But property tax foreclosure is a completely different process that doesn't have anything to do with assignment of mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So property tax foreclosure is a separate process, and there's 2 ways that property tax foreclosure can happen. One is a lien system, and one is a centralized system. I believe Baltimore, you guys have a lien system here. Yeah, Yeah, but in Detroit, we have the second, we used to have a lien system, and then it switched over where it's centralized, and then the debt collector is actually the county treasurer instead of individuals through the lien system. So that's the two ways nationally that property tax foreclosure works, but it's very different than mortgage foreclosure.
Awesome. Well, not awesome, but thank you. And so before we close out, we have a quick word to hear from the co-founder of the Dignity Restoration Project. So come on down.
Thank you. If you are fired up and wondering, how do I get involved? How do I act? Thank you. And I can feel it in the room that people are engaged. Bernadette's work, scholarship, has inspired this work that's on these index cards, the Dignity Restoration Project. And I want to just take a moment to emphasize some of the national picture that this Dignity Restoration Project is situated in. Across the country, there are reparations commissions that are researching historic harms. The state of California, the state of New York, the state of Illinois, over a dozen cities, and hundreds of other local redress efforts. And as those commissions move from research that's documenting the harms, they will need to move to action. How do you actually mobilize the money to start compensating people? How do you define eligibility? How do you actually move that money with integrity? How do you engage with the community, as Bernadette has done, to also figure out how to communicate this well in a way that actually unites us? At a time in our country where we need racial repair as a fundamental part of also strengthening our democracy. So if you care about democracy, if you care about the role of racial repair in strengthening our democracy, we'd love your support. Take a look at what we're doing on this index card. Come greet me if you have a chance in the last bit. Thank you.
And I know we have some fundraising professionals in the room, so if you are a fundraising professional, please talk to him. We are, again, in the process of figuring out how to raise this $10 million for this compensation in Detroit, to start the compensation in Detroit. So please talk to him if you are in the field or have some contacts with some foundations, whatever. That's the man to talk to.
And so now, please help me to thank our moderator, Lawrence Brown. And tonight's author, Bernadette Atuahene.
Books are for sale by books outside. Reminder not be assigned. They are all individually sourced in the library of the author. So what we don't outside fairly photos, and additional questions, the outside moment. Thank you for joining us this evening.